The fluorescent lights hummed overhead like trapped insects as Laura Bennett clocked in at 11:13 p.m., her badge clinking softly against the stainless steel of the time clock. Oak Creek Memorial's ICU corridor stretched before her, 17 beds, 3 nurses assigned, one of them calling in sick at the last minute. She'd worked 127 consecutive shifts without complaint. The smell of antiseptic and stale coffee hung in the air like a permanent resident, and somewhere down the hallway, a ventilator wheezed its mechanical rhythm, patient and endless. She hung her jacket on the hook inside her locker, careful not to disturb the faded unit patch sewn into the lining. Her hands were steady as she smoothed the fabric, letting her fingers rest there for just a moment before closing the door. 14 years she'd been at Oak Creek. 14 years of arriving before dawn, staying after sunset, asking for nothing but the rhythm of the work itself. The ICU nurses knew her name. The residents whispered it like an apology. Dr. Hargrove pretended she didn't exist. The break room was empty when she arrived, which meant she could prepare her charts without conversation. Laura had learned to move through Oak Creek like water, present but unnoticed, competent but invisible. A 4-star general occupied bed 7, post-op from an emergency splenectomy, stable but guarded. His family had been asking questions all evening. His daughter, a woman with angry eyes and the kind of composure that came from inherited money, had questioned every intervention, every medication, every decision made in the 12 hours Laura had cared for him. The general himself drifted in and out of consciousness, his body healing faster than his mind could follow. By 1:13 a.m., Laura had reviewed his chart twice. Hemoglobin stable at 9.2. Urine output adequate. Pain controlled on morphine for milligrams every 4 hours. The vitals were textbook recovery, which meant the real work was surveillance, watching for the complications that lived in the spaces between normal readings. She checked the foresight, confirmed the placement of the epidural catheter, verified that his oxygen saturation held steady at 96% on 2 liters. Everything was fine. Everything would remain fine because she would not allow it to be otherwise. The morning rounds began at 7:22 a.m., which meant Dr. Hargrove arrived at 7:19 in his pressed white coat, his stethoscope draped like a medal. He was a man built from privilege and appointment, the kind of doctor who made decisions because he had the authority to make them, not because he understood the patients. Behind him came the general's daughter, the general's son, and a woman Laura recognized as the hospital's patient advocate. They moved like a delegation through the ICU, and Laura felt the weight of their attention before they reached bed 7. Hargrove's voice filled the space like an engine idling in a garage, smooth and powerful and completely indifferent to the human being in the bed. "The patient is progressing adequately," he said, glancing at the monitor without reading it. "Though I should mention that our nursing staff has been somewhat overzealous with care protocols. Some of our less experienced nurses occasionally overestimate their abilities, particularly regarding procedures that fall outside standard scope." Laura stood at the medication cart, her hands continuing their work without hesitation. She reached for the next patient's antibiotics, her movements precise and practiced. But she was listening. Everyone was listening. "What does that mean?" the general's daughter asked, her voice sharp with suspicion. "Is my father's care not adequate?" Hargrove turned to face them, and Laura watched him in her peripheral vision. He had the expression of a man delivering important news, though his words were designed to land as questions. "Nurse Bennett insisted on several monitoring procedures last evening that I would characterize as beyond her competence level. She was quite resistant when I suggested alternative approaches. That kind of initiative, while well-intentioned, can sometimes create complications we don't anticipate." The general's son shifted his weight, confused. "Is my father stable?" "For now," Hargrove said. "Yes. But you can see how oversight matters." Laura moved to the next medication, then the next, her jaw clenching once, a small, imperceptible moment of restraint. The general's daughter was staring at her now, the anger in her eyes expanding to include this woman in the blue scrubs who apparently threatened her father's recovery through ambition. Laura felt the weight of the contempt and absorbed it without flinching, without a single muscle in her face betraying the effort required to stand still while someone questioned her competence in front of the man whose life she'd spent all night protecting. When the rounds moved on, when Hargrove and the family disappeared around the corner toward bed 8, Laura exhaled once. One measured breath. Her hands continued their work. The 4 fluids didn't infuse themselves. The medications didn't distribute themselves. The work existed independent of anyone's opinion about who should be doing it. The break room at 9:37 a.m. was where the real damage happened. 3 nurses sat with their coffee when Laura entered, Murphy, who worked nights, Jackson from the day shift, and Chen, who supervised the rotation. They were mid-conversation when Laura pulled out her chair, their voices dropping like stones into water. They did not look at her. Murphy stood first, taking her cup to the sink. Jackson gathered her phone. Chen slowly collected her papers and followed them out without speaking. The door closed behind them with a soft click, and Laura sat alone with the fluorescent lights and the hum of the refrigerator and the absolute clarity that the infection had begun. By 10:46 a.m., a formal write-up was pinned to the unit board in red ink. Performance Improvement Plan. Scope of Practice Violation. Failure to respect physician authority. Dr. Hargrove had already made 3 phone calls, she would later learn, 2 to board members and 1 to the nursing school where she'd earned her credentials, all of them questions framed as concerns. The network was activating. The machine was moving. Oak Creek Memorial was a hospital with a structure, and that structure depended on people knowing their place. Laura read the document without changing her expression, though she had to grip the edge of the counter to keep her hands from trembling. Not from fear. From restraint. From the precise calculation of how much force it would take to walk away right now versus how much discipline it would take to stay. The general woke around noon, his eyes focusing with the slow precision of someone returning from deep water. He looked at her name badge, Bennett, and his own hand moved to his forearm, touching a faded tattoo inked there in letters that spelled out a name. His eyes narrowed, searching, but the memory remained submerged beneath the morphine and the fog of recovery. He didn't ask. He closed his eyes again and slept, and Laura stood beside his bed and said nothing, understanding with the clarity of experience that some recognitions come too late, that some debts can never be settled, that some names belong to ghosts only. Dr. Hargrove stood outside the ICU room, his posture angled toward the general's assembled family like a man delivering grave news from a position of authority. His voice carried the careful cadence of institutional language, each word chosen to plant doubt. Our less experienced staff sometimes overestimate their abilities, he said, shaking his head with theatrical concern. Nurse Bennett insisted on procedures beyond her competence. We are fortunate the patient survived despite her interventions. The general's daughter, arms crossed, fixed Laura with a stare that could have melted steel. Laura felt the weight of that contempt from the hallway. She took one measured breath. The fluorescent overhead light buzzed, a sound like static in her skull. She met the daughter's eyes without flinching, wiped away the single tear that had escaped with the back of her hand, and spoke in an even tone that carried no apology. I followed the protocol that kept your father alive through the night. The words hung there. The daughter's face flushed. Hargrove's jaw tightened, a micro-expression of frustration that he couldn't quite contain before he turned back to the family, speaking louder, faster, reclaiming narrative control. Laura turned and walked down the corridor. Her hands were steady. Her breathing measured. The humiliation had landed exactly where he'd aimed it, and she'd absorbed it the way trained operators absorb incoming fire, by being somewhere else internally. The break room smelled like burnt coffee and the ghost of something that had been microwaved too many times. Laura sat alone with her cup at 9:36 a.m., her shoulders against the beige wall, watching steam rise from the ceramic. The 3 nurses, Melissa, Chen, and Rodriguez, had been mid-conversation when she entered. Mid-laugh, actually. Something about the new resident. The conversation had stopped like a light switch. They'd exchanged glances. Then, without a word, all 3 stood simultaneously and left. The synchronization of it was almost impressive. Almost. She didn't call out. Didn't apologize. Didn't pretend not to notice. That wasn't how this worked. Hargrove had sent the message through channels, whispered the narrative, painted her as a liability. Now the staff was performing its obedience. Compliance was safer than association. She understood the calculus. 14 years ago in Kandahar, she'd understood it then too, the way fear trickled down through hierarchies, the way good people made small choices that accumulated into indifference. By afternoon, the formal write-up was pinned to the unit board in red ink, impossible to miss. Laura stood in front of it with her water bottle in hand, reading the words as if they belonged to someone else. Performance improvement plan. Overreach. Failure to respect physician authority. Clinical judgment outside scope of practice. The language was Hargrove's, precise, institutional, unarguable in its officialese. 3 board members' names appeared on the memo. A line referencing outside investigation pending. She'd been on the receiving end of performance reviews before, though not in this life. Different language then. Different context. But the same message: you are a problem. You are being documented. You are being eliminated. She pulled the memo from the board without tearing it, folded it carefully, and placed it in the pocket of her scrubs. Evidence. Someday, someone might need to see the exact sequence. The exact timing. How quickly an institution could turn against one person once permission was granted. At 10:13 a.m., the general opened his eyes. His gaze moved slowly around the room, the drip stand, the monitor, the window where grey Denver sky pressed against the glass. Then it landed on Laura's name badge. Something flickered across his face. Not recognition, exactly. Something deeper. His hand moved slowly, deliberately, and he touched the tattoo on his forearm, a name in faded ink, the letters blurred from 24 years of sun and living. Bennett. He stared at it as if it might rearrange itself into clarity. His lips moved silently. Then his eyes drifted closed again. Laura stood motionless, watching him. She knew what that tattoo meant. She knew exactly why it was there. But the knowing had no place in this room, in this moment. The general couldn't place her. Couldn't marry the face in front of him with whatever memory the name carried from a cave outside Kandahar where blood had pooled on cold stone and she'd held his shoulder to the ground and told him to breathe, stay with me, we're getting out. That was another life. Another woman entirely. She turned away from his bed and headed toward her next round. Her composure held. Her hands didn't shake. The mask stayed intact. By 14:22 p.m., Hargrove had already made 3 calls. The first to James Sterling, a board member whose daughter he'd hired into a fellowship against better clinical judgment, a favor owed, now being called in. The second to Patricia Marks, who controlled physician credentialing and owed him for his silence regarding certain prescribing patterns that didn't bear scrutiny. The third to Michael Graves, chief of staff, with whom he shared membership at Denver Athletic Club and a mutual understanding that institutional loyalty moved in both directions. He'd also contacted 3 of Laura's references from her nursing degree, leaving voicemails that were carefully worded, professionally concerned, asking probing questions about her clinical history, her judgment under pressure, whether she'd ever been flagged for scope violations. The references would call back. Word would spread. By the time this was done, her reputation would be a controlled burn, every exit route cut off. Hargrove sat in his office with the door closed, his fingers stepped in front of his face. Laura Bennett had exposed something he couldn't allow to remain exposed. In that moment during the morning code, with the family present and the nurses watching, she'd moved with an authority that didn't belong to someone with her title. She'd made decisions. She'd been right. And everyone had seen it. The hierarchy depended on clear authority. On physicians being the repository of clinical knowledge. On nurses asking permission before acting. She'd simply acted. And she'd been correct. And that was a threat he couldn't tolerate. He made a 4th call, this time to a private investigator he'd used before, and provided Laura's home address, her nursing license number, and the simple directive, I need everything. Any gaps, any connections, anything that doesn't align with her official record. Not because it would help his case. But because if she had secrets, he would find them, and secrets were weapons. The hours passed. Afternoon dissolved into evening. The shift changed over at 7 p.m. Night nurses arrived. The hospital's rhythm shifted into the slower pulse of overnight operations. Fewer visitors. Fewer family members clustering in hallways. Fewer witnesses. Laura moved through her duties with the practiced efficiency of someone who'd been doing this for 3 years, or 30, or in a previous life where sleep meant nightmares and waking meant remembering what she'd left behind. She didn't know it yet. But in 6 hours, when the monitors would shriek, when the general's oxygen saturation would plummet and his trachea would deviate and every physician on staff would be mysteriously unavailable, she would move into the role that had defined her for 15 years. She would become what she'd been trying not to be. And that's when the real nightmare would begin. The monitor's steady beat became the only sound in the ICU at 2:06 a.m. Laura was documenting vitals in the general's room when his chest went rigid. Not the gentle rise and fall of sleep. Rigid. Like concrete. His hand clenched the bed rail, oxygen saturation already dropping, 94, 92, 89. The monitors screamed what his body already knew. Tension pneumothorax. Collapsed lung pressing against his heart, compressing it like a fist closing. She hit the call button. Waited. Nothing. She paged Dr. Hargrove. Operator said he wasn't responding. She tried the resident on call, Dr. Morrison. Voicemail. The attending physician for trauma? Not picking up. Saturation dropped to 87. The general's neck veins were distending, his trachea visibly deviated toward the right. His skin turned from tan to a shade of ash that meant minutes, not hours. Seconds felt like they were being rationed. Laura's hands moved to the crash cart. Muscle memory took over. Not the muscle memory of a nurse. Something deeper. Something older. The kind of muscle memory that lives in a body that has already done this with bullets flying and dust in the air. With the smell of diesel fuel and blood mixing in the wind. Kandahar. A village outside Sanjin. A young soldier with a punctured lung, wheezing in the back of a compound that wasn't a hospital, that was barely shelter. She'd done this with an IV catheter and a prayer and nothing else because there was nothing else. The sensory details crashed back, the heat, the metallic taste of fear, the sound of small arms fire echoing off mud walls. But this wasn't then. This was now. This was Denver. This was Oak Creek Memorial. This was a patient who couldn't be saved by anyone else. She already had the 14-gauge angiocath needle in her hand. Not thinking. Knowing. Second intercostal space. Midclavicular line. Her fingers found the anatomical landmark, the narrow space between ribs, the exact spot where pressure and precision could mean the difference between a heartbeat continuing and a heartbeat stopping. The general's eyes were locked on her face. He couldn't speak. His airway was compromised, his oxygen plummeting. 84, 81. 79. Stay with me, she said. Not a request. A command. The needle went in. Clean. Practiced. Her shoulders dropped back into a posture she hadn't worn in 5 years, not a nurse's stance, but the stance of someone trained in field medicine under conditions that had no margin for error. The hiss. That crucial hiss of trapped air escaping. The pressure releasing. The sound of oxygen rushing out like a held breath finally being released. Immediate and unmistakable. The saturation numbers climbed. 75, 82. 88, 92. Stable. She taped the catheter down with precise movements, checked the lung sounds, bilateral now, not that awful collapsed silence on the right, and stepped back as the general's breathing deepened. His color returned from ash to something closer to human. His eye stayed on her. Confusion and recognition warring in his expression. He reached toward his forearm, toward something beneath his hospital gown, but his hand fell back to the bed. A resident finally appeared in the doorway, Dr. Patel, the 26-year-old fresh out of Johns Hopkins who'd been in the cafeteria ignoring his pages. He stopped. Stared at the patient. Stared at the needle still venting air at the second ICS mid-clavicular. Stared at Laura. Did you? He couldn't finish the sentence. Tension pneumothorax, she said. Voice level. Needle decompression. He needs a chest tube and a surgeon, but he needs to stay breathing first. Call thoracics. Now. It wasn't a request. It was a command. The kind of command that made Dr. Patel move immediately, pulling out his phone without asking a single question. The kind of command that made a junior physician understand that whatever hierarchy he thought existed in that room had just shifted on its axis. But that wasn't the moment that changed everything. The moment that changed everything came when the general's eyes, still fixed on her face, moved to her badge. The way his pupils dilated. The way his hand, trembling now with something other than shock, reached for the area below his left collarbone. The tattoo beneath his hospital gown. The one he'd been touching that morning in rounds. The one that bore a name in faded ink. Bennett. Her last name. 24 years old in permanent marker, added by a medic in a village outside Kandahar who'd carried him 3 miles through enemy fire with his lung collapsed and his spine fractured and his will to live the only thing keeping him conscious. He mouthed her rank. Not her name. Her rank. Senior Chief. The words never made it past his compressed airway, but his lips formed them clearly enough that she could read them. The question in his eyes was unmistakable. Is it you? She didn't answer. She couldn't. Not here. Not now. Not with Dr. Patel on the phone and the thoracic team already being paged and the institutional world that had spent the entire previous day dismantling her still turning, still grinding, still determined to finish the job Hargrove had started. She documented the procedure in the chart with clinical precision. Tension pneumothorax. Needle decompression. 14-gauge angiocath. Bilateral lung sounds post-procedure. Saturation recovered to 94. Vital stable. Nothing in her notes revealed what her hands knew. Nothing in her documentation said that the muscles that had just performed an emergency procedure with textbook precision weren't a nurse's muscles at all, but the muscles of someone trained to make life or death decisions in conditions where a second's hesitation meant death. The general didn't speak. Not while the chest tube was placed. Not while he was transferred to the surgical ICU. Not while the team of attending physicians finally arrived, the same attending physicians who hadn't answered their pages at 2:06 a.m. when a man was suffocating in his own chest cavity. She knew why they hadn't answered. Hargrove had made sure of it. She'd overheard him in the lounge at 1:41 a.m., phone to his ear, voice low and careful. If Bennett calls, I need you unreachable for the next 2 hours. Strategic. Precise. Network activation. The kind of move a competent villain made when he needed someone to fail so completely that no one would ever question his version of events again. But the general had lived instead. By 6:11 a.m., the unit board showed a new update, Laura Bennett reassigned to telemetry floor effective immediately. Dr. Hargrove had made another move. She was being removed from the general's care. She was being put somewhere that wouldn't interfere with his narrative. Somewhere that wouldn't allow her to be present for the investigation he'd already triggered. Somewhere that ensured she'd be easy to dismiss and difficult to defend. She changed units without comment. No complaints. No arguments. She simply gathered her things from the break room, the same break room where the other nurses had abandoned her yesterday, and moved downstairs to monitor a cardiac patient who was stable and required minimal intervention. By noon, the reassignment became permanent. By afternoon, another write-up appeared. This time for a scope of practice violation. For emergency procedures outside nursing protocol. For failure to wait for physician authorization. She didn't look at it. She didn't defend it. She clocked out at 7:41 p.m. and drove to the cemetery in the rain. True class is what you do when the lights go out. By 6:13 a.m., Dr. Hargrove had already made 3 calls. The hospital administrator picked up on the second ring. We have a compliance issue, Hargrove said, his voice steady and surgical. Nurse Bennett overstepped her scope last night. Performed procedures well beyond her competence level. I'm documenting everything. The administrator listened. Hargrove had spent 14 years cultivating relationships with board members, and he knew exactly which strings pulled which direction. By 6:44 a.m., 2 board members had been called. By 7:15 a.m., a state nursing board investigator was already being contacted. This wasn't panic. This was precision. Laura clocked out as the morning shift arrived, her badge still clipped to her scrubs. The hallway felt different now, and narrower somehow, the walls leaning in. She didn't check on the general. That door had already closed. She stopped by her locker to grab her jacket and found a manila envelope taped to the door. The envelope was sealed. Inside, typed in capital letters on official hospital letterhead, immediate administrative action, performance improvement plan. The words blurred as she read them. Scope violation. Failure to respect physician authority. Overreach. The write-up was dated 2:38 a.m., the exact minute she'd driven the needle between the general's ribs. Someone had time-stamped her salvation. By 10:33 a.m., a woman in a charcoal suit arrived at Oak Creek Memorial carrying a leather portfolio. State Nursing Board investigator. She moved through the ICU like an audit, asking questions about Laura's credentials, her training, her certifications. Laura watched from across the unit as the woman reviewed files, made notes, nodded at Dr. Hargrove. He had activated his network with the precision of a man who understood institutional leverage. The investigator spent 40 minutes reviewing Laura's personnel file, which had somehow already been flagged for immediate administrative action. The timing was too perfect. Too coordinated. Laura understood then what she was witnessing, not justice, but machinery. And she was the problem the machinery had identified and was working to eliminate. At 11:52 a.m., her file was officially posted on the unit board. Red ink. A public humiliation dressed in administrative language. The staff pretended not to notice. Or perhaps they genuinely didn't care. Either way, Laura had become the kind of person other people walked away from. At noon, security arrived with a cardboard box. Not angry, not hostile, just there to do a job. The same guard who'd waved hello on her first day. "I'm sorry," he said, and he meant it. Just procedure. Laura packed her belongings in 30 seconds. Her stethoscope. Her clinical notebook. The change of clothes she kept in her locker. The worn copy of the Denver Post from 3 weeks ago she'd been meaning to recycle. And at the very bottom, wrapped in tissue paper, the faded unit patch, sewn years ago into the lining of her jacket before she'd walked away from everything. Before she'd decided that staying alive meant becoming someone else. She didn't argue. She didn't defend herself. She simply removed her badge and handed it to the guard. It felt heavier than it had any right to feel. He placed it gently on the counter. "The way out?" he asked quietly. Laura nodded toward the elevator. She'd know the way out of any building. She'd made extraction routes her life's work. By 1:15 p.m., the cardboard box was in her car. By 2:33 p.m., she was standing at the cemetery in the northwestern part of Denver, where the rain fell like it had a personal vendetta. The grave was unmarked except for a simple stone, Michael Bennett, 1989 to 2019. For years gone. The rain soaked through her scrubs, which she'd never changed out of. She stood there in the downpour, holding the wet cardboard box against her chest like it might fall apart if she didn't, and whispered the only words that seemed to matter. "I saved him again and it still wasn't enough. I failed you. I failed them all." The rain didn't answer. It never did. She lowered the box to the ground and pulled out the unit patch. The fabric was frayed at the edges, the embroidery barely visible anymore. 15 years ago, she'd worn this on her shoulder. 15 years as a decorated senior chief petty officer in Special Forces. 3 tours through Kandahar. 19 medical evacuations under fire. 2 soldiers she'd carried 3 miles through hostile territory, one of them a young general then, just a lieutenant with his leg shattered and his radio dead. She'd kept him breathing in a cave outside Kandahar for 24 hours while the sandstorm raged outside and the Taliban searched the hills. She'd whispered to him the whole time, telling him about her husband waiting back home, about the garden they were going to plant, about the normal life that was waiting if he could just hold on a little longer. The PTSD had come after the last tour. It came quiet at first, a hand tremor that wouldn't stop, a sound in the night that sent her crawling under the bed. Then louder. Nightmares that made her scream. Hypervigilance that made her tear her kitchen apart looking for threats that didn't exist. Michael had held her through the first 3 years. He'd left a note on the kitchen counter after the 4th year, "I can't watch this anymore. I'm sorry." She'd spent the next 2 years in VA facilities, in therapy, in support groups where men with scars and bad dreams told her it would get better. It hadn't gotten better. It had just gotten quieter. She'd realized that healing meant disappearing. She'd walked away from the special operations community without telling anyone where she was going. Not her commanding officers. Not her sister. Not even the young lieutenant she'd saved in Kandahar. She'd learned later he'd made it, had gone on to command troops, had made general. She'd let him wonder what happened to her. It was safer that way. The anonymity had helped. A quiet ICU job where she could save people without the weight of command, without the responsibility of teams, without having to prove anything to anyone. Just a nurse. Just someone who understood pain and how to keep people alive. She'd been fine. Or she'd been something close enough to fine that she could pretend. She held the unit patch out over the grave, seriously considering letting the rain take it. Seriously considering dropping it into the mud and walking away from all of it. From Oak Creek Memorial. From Denver. From the carefully constructed identity of Laura Bennett, ICU nurse. She could disappear again. She'd done it before. But then she heard something. Not the rain. Not the wind. Something else, a distant sound, like thunder but with a rhythm to it. Like rotor blades cutting through air. Laura froze. The sound grew louder. Closer. Impossible in the rain. And then the engine noise hit her full force. Not metaphorical thunder. Actual aircraft. She looked up as the first Black Hawk helicopter descended through the clouds above the cemetery, its rotor wash scattering rain like bullets. Her hands moved before her mind caught up. She shoved the patch back into her jacket pocket. She stood. The cardboard box fell into the mud. 2 more Black Hawks descended behind the first. Boots on tile. 1, 2, 3, 4. No. Not tile. Not anymore. Concrete. The cemetery driveway. The first helicopter touched down and soldiers in dress uniforms began to move toward her position with the precision of men who knew exactly where they were going. The rotor wash shook the headstones. And Laura Bennett, standing alone at her dead husband's grave in the freezing rain with nothing but a cardboard box and 15 years of hiding, understood that the quiet was over. The Black Hawks descended like judgment, landing in a coordinated triangle that shattered the cemetery silence. Rotor wash flattened the rain sideways. Laura didn't move. She stood with her unit patch pressed against her chest as boots hit the ground, 14 of them, in perfect formation. A Navy SEAL commander emerged first, storm gray eyes scanning the headstones until they locked on her face. Behind him, 3 operators in tactical gear. Behind them, an older man in a dark suit with a federal badge clipped to his belt. They didn't approach. They simply waited, boots planted in the mud, while she finished saying goodbye to a man who'd never known what she'd become. She turned to face them. Senior Chief. The SEAL commander saluted, fist to chest, the sound like a distant gunshot. You're needed. Laura didn't ask how they'd found her. She didn't ask what had changed. She walked toward them with the unit patch still in her hand, and the operators fell into step beside her like she'd never left. The drive back to Oak Creek Memorial took 17 minutes. Nobody spoke. The rain hammered the windshield like applause, and Laura watched the city lights blur past, Denver's skyline bleeding gold and white against the storm clouds. By the time they reached the hospital, she already knew what was waiting. The Afghan interpreter who'd been admitted through the ER 3 days earlier with a stab wound, the one whose file she'd been assigned to pull when they called her back for weekend staffing. Her hands had trembled reading that name. Mirza Khalid. 28 years old. From Khost province, worked as a DOD translator, stab wound to the left anterior chest. The intake notes mentioned him asking for a tall American nurse, dark hair, scar on her left forearm. He was asking for someone by description. Someone he remembered. The hospital corridor still smelled the same, antiseptic and old coffee and something underneath that no amount of cleaning could remove. The smell of people's last moments. Laura moved through it like she'd never left, and every nurse they passed stopped walking. Eyes tracked her. Word traveled faster than footsteps. By the time they reached the ICU, half the floor knew something massive was happening. A SEAL team doesn't walk into a hospital without reason. Federal badges don't show without cause. Mirza was conscious. Laura saw him the moment she stepped into the room, younger than she expected, face thin from interrogation camps he'd survived before working as a translator, chest wrapped in fresh bandages that showed seepage at the edges. Blood loss controlled, infection risk moderate, vitals holding. Her assessment took 3 seconds. But when he looked up from his gurney and his eyes went wide, recognition moved across his face like sunrise. His voice came out raw, cracked from intubation and shock. Senior Chief Bennett. Not a question. A statement. An accusation. A prayer. You pulled me from the rubble. The words weren't loud, but the room absorbed them like they'd been screamed. A gathered crowd materialized, nurses who'd been pretending not to watch, the attending physician who'd been writing notes, an orderly frozen in the doorway. The silence stretched for exactly 3 seconds. Then the general's son stepped forward, the Navy SEAL commander, Commander James Mitchell, decorated operator from SEAL Team 3, the kind of man who made decisions with one breath and executed them with the next. What did you just call her? Mirza's eyes never left Laura's face. Senior Chief. Kandahar. Village outside the city, 2019. Her unit was extracting a high-value target. They hit an IED. Building collapsed. She was the only one who could reach the general. She dug through concrete with her bare hands. 32 minutes. She carried him 3 miles under fire. No medic. Just her. His voice strengthened as memory clarified what trauma had obscured. She kept him breathing. She kept him talking. I was the interpreter. I watched her do it. The attending physician's face had gone the color of institutional beige. He was measuring the room, calculating angles, understanding that the hierarchy he'd accepted had just inverted. The hospital administrator appeared in the doorway. Laura hadn't even called, but word of federal presence travels faster than elevator doors. Behind him, security. Behind security, Dr. Hargrove, who'd been reviewing charts 2 floors down and had felt the shift in atmospheric pressure the way predators sense a disturbance in water. The conference room assembly took 42 minutes to arrange. Mirza gave his testimony first, medicated but clear, the location, the mission parameters, the fact that Laura had been working trauma for 75 consecutive hours before that extraction and performed perfectly anyway. Then the general himself, wheeled in with his daughter hovering at his shoulder, alert enough now to speak in full sentences. His memories were sharp. Bone sharp. He described the cave. He described Laura's hands. He described waking up 3 times during that extraction and each time seeing her face close enough to count the scars. The SEAL team leader, a man whose shoulder board carried insignia that outranked everyone present, stepped forward with a folder. Paper, not digital. Old school. The kind of secure documentation that doesn't live on network servers. He read from it like scripture, and each sentence hung in the conference room air before settling. Bronze Star for Valor under fire. Mirza nodded. The general's eyes closed. Second Bronze Star for exceptional medical intervention outside normal scope of practice. The attending physician gripped the table edge. Purple Heart for combat injury sustained during that same operation. Pause. Breath. The room was holding its breath. Navy Cross for extraordinary heroism in actions that resulted in saving the lives of 14 operatives, including one 4-star general, in conditions that exceeded the capability of available medical personnel. Dr. Hargrove stood throughout this recitation. His face drained in real time. Not the accelerated drain of sudden shock, the slow, methodical draining of someone watching every institutional ally suddenly become irrelevant. His board member connections didn't matter. His tenure. His reputation. His careful documentation of her scope violations meant exactly nothing when what she'd violated scope for was saving 14 lives in a theater command of the United States military. The FBI liaison agent, whose badge read 32 years of federal service and whose eyes had the flatness of someone who'd investigated things he couldn't discuss, presented the declassified mission summary. Kandahar. 2019, Operation Nightingale. 14 personnel extracted. 0 fatalities. Attribution: Senior Chief Petty Officer Laura Bennett, Field Medic, 75th Ranger Regiment attached to 160th SAW. Her participation classified until present date due to ongoing international security protocols. The general reached out and touched her hand. Just once. Just for a second. His daughter started crying. Dr. Hargrove's mouth moved, but nothing emerged. He tried twice. His hand shook. On the third attempt, he pushed backward from the conference table and walked toward the door with the measured steps of someone who'd just watched his entire world become transparent. No one stopped him. There was no need. His network, the board members, the investigators, the references he'd contacted, had all just learned simultaneously that they'd been advocating against a decorated military hero while trying to protect a man whose career had just become genuinely expendable. Laura stood as he left. She didn't say anything. She didn't need to. Security found him in the stairwell 2 floors down, sitting on a step with his face in his hands. They didn't speak either. They just waited while he gathered himself, and when he looked up, they handed him a cardboard box. Same size as the one he'd watched them carry out with Laura's belongings 48 hours earlier. His personal effects. His hospital badge. His resignation letter, pre-signed. The security guard, the same one who'd escorted Laura out, smiled the way people smile at funerals. "I believe you know the way out." The walkout took 3 minutes. The ER staff watched him pass. The attending physicians. The nurses he'd trained. The administrators who'd taken his calls. By the time he reached the automatic doors, every person in that hospital understood the calculus. They'd backed the wrong player. The institutional power structure he'd leveraged had dissolved the moment federal authority entered the building and said, "This woman matters more than you." 6 months later, a security camera caught Dr. Hargrove selling supplemental insurance from a folding table outside a strip mall urgent care in Tucson. The name tag read Steve. His hand shook when handing business cards to customers. He flinched when anyone called him doctor. Laura stood beside the general at the hospital auditorium ceremony. Oak Creek Memorial had announced 3 major changes: a new veteran care initiative funded through grants the general had personally secured, a trauma rotation redesign that elevated nursing judgment to co-equal decision authority, and the establishment of a senior chief petty officer mentorship program. The general wore his dress uniform, medals arranged in descending order of prestige, salute precise as a surgical instrument, bearing the weight of a man who'd lived because someone refused to accept a hierarchy that prioritized authority over competence. He presented her with the unit patch. The same patch. The one she'd carried to her husband's grave. Now framed in shadow box glass, beside a citation that read her full name and her rank and the thing she'd been running from for 15 years, she'd saved lives. She'd saved them competently. She'd saved them under conditions that broke regulations and defied authority and challenged every institutional structure that said a nurse should defer to a doctor even when that doctor was making the wrong decision. The general's eyes were clear when he handed it to her. His voice steady. "This has been sewn inside my jacket lining for 24 years, he said. "Your name? So I would remember. So I would tell everyone who mattered." He smiled. "I just finally got the chance." Laura took it. Around them, 200 people, military personnel in dress blues, nurses in white, physicians who'd learned something they couldn't teach, stood and applauded. The sound filled the auditorium like water filling a vessel that had been empty far too long. She didn't cry. Her composure held because composure was what she'd built out of 15 years of hiding. But when she looked down at the patch, at the thread that had never come loose despite everything, the fire, the explosion, the jumping from aircraft, the 15 years pretending to be someone less than she was, she understood the equation. The trembling wasn't fear. It was the precise moment her restraint was finally permitted to end. That evening, she returned to Oak Creek Memorial. Not as an employee. Not yet. As a consultant reviewing the trauma protocols that had allowed her dismissal. The hallway was quiet. The night shift had started. The unit board that once carried her right up in red ink had been replaced with new assignments. She passed through it like a person walking through her own life for the first time, seeing it with the eyes of someone who'd finally earned the right to stand there. A barista at the hospital cafe, young, 20s, with the kind of nervous energy of someone who'd noticed her coming in for coffee every morning for a month, was waiting at the counter. When Laura ordered, the barista wrote something on the cup beside her name. Not her number. Her daughter's number. The barista's mother had been a combat medic. Had served in Kandahar. Had come home with PTSD that nobody knew how to address until she found a nurse who understood. The mother was healing now. The barista wanted Laura to know that. Laura held the cup and nearly smiled. The hospital board offered her the position of Chief of Trauma Services 2 weeks later. Director position. 6 figures. Authority that would have seemed impossible 6 months ago. She turned them down. She asked for something smaller. She asked to go back into scrubs. She asked for night shift in the ICU. She asked for the hardest cases and the patients nobody else wanted to hold and the emergency codes that came at 2 a.m. when decisions had to be perfect because people were dying. The board president tried to argue. Laura cut him off. "My fight is here now." By then, everyone who mattered already understood. The quiet person in the room had been holding it all together the entire time. The ones who'd seen the worst weren't running anymore. They were staying. They were teaching. They were saving the next generation of people who'd learned that competence matters more than credentials, and that sometimes the bravest thing you can do is wear scrubs and simply refuse to let someone die because a doctor's ego wouldn't bend. True class is what you do when the lights go out. Laura Bennett walked back to her ICU unit at 11:19 p.m., clipped her badge to her scrubs, and reviewed the patient roster for the night. Critical case in bed 4. Post-operative bleeding in 6. Septic shock in 2. Exactly where she belonged. When a monitor alarmed at 2:13 a.m., her hands didn't hesitate. Her voice didn't shake. She moved like someone who'd finally stopped pretending, and every nurse on that unit watched her work and understood they were watching a hero who'd chosen to save lives in the dark, where nobody was watching, where the real war happened every single night. Have you ever been underestimated by someone who didn't know your true value? Or judge someone without knowing the full story? Subscribe to the channel, like this video, and share in the comments what would you have done in Laura's position.